Hey, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are digging into a story that, on the surface, feels incredibly familiar. We're talking about a brutal civil war in Mount Lebanon back in 1860, one that pitted Druze against Maronite Christian. And the common explanation? Well, it's the one we always hear, ancient religious hatreds just boiling over. But what if that whole story is just plain wrong?
Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1860, and Mount Lebanon is on fire. Villages are being wiped out, thousands are being killed in this incredibly savage conflict between the Druze and Maronite communities. For a local writer at the time, it was so horrific, so complete, that it could only be the devil's work. For outsiders looking in, it seemed to confirm what they already believed. This was a tragic, clear-cut case of deep-seated religious hate finally erupting into violence.
And this is the explosive idea at the heart of the book we're diving into. It challenges pretty much everything we think we know about this conflict. It suggests that this sectarian divide wasn't some primordial force of history bubbling under the surface for centuries. No, it was something that was actively and pretty recently invented. This right here, this contrast, perfectly frames our whole investigation. On one side, you've got the common myth, the story you've probably heard, a timeless feud between two religions. And on the other, the really shocking argument we're going to explore, that this feud was actually a modern political creation, built from the ground up in the 19th century. So how in the world do we get from one to the other? Well, first, we're going to tackle the myth of this ancient hatred. Then, we'll journey back to a time before sectarianism, to a world they called the Old Domain of Obedience. After that, we'll see how Europe's gentle crusades started to change everything, how new reforms led straight to violence and partition, and finally, how this new sectarian identity was ultimately created. All right, so let's start with that accepted story. When the violence kicked off, the powerful people of the world were quick to offer a diagnosis. The British Foreign Secretary, for instance, was absolutely certain that the bad blood between these groups was of ancient date. And you know what? That idea, it really stuck. And this really captures the consensus at the time. The great empires, both European and Ottoman, they didn't see the conflict as a product of their own policies or recent history. Nope, they saw it as proof that Mount Lebanon was just a backward, primitive place full of barbarous people. It was a simple explanation, a convenient one, and, as we're about to see, a profoundly wrong one. To really understand what happened, we've got to rewind the clock. We have to go back in time to the world that existed in Mount Lebanon before the 19th century. A world that, believe me, operated on a completely different set of rules. Here's the crucial thing to get. If you asked someone back then who they were, they wouldn't have led with, "I'm a Maronite" or "I'm a Druze." Their main identity was tied to their family, their village, their social rank, and, most importantly, their loyalty to a specific lord. In fact, Druzes and Maronites often lived right next to each other, sharing customs and answering to the exact same ruling family. This whole system had a name, the Domain of Obedience. It was a really strict social hierarchy. You were loyal to your local lord, who was loyal to a more powerful lord, and so on, all the way up the chain to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. The big social divide wasn't Christian versus Druze. It was between the rulers, the notable families, and the common people, the Ahali. You know, the ruler of Mount Lebanon at the time, Emir Bashir Shihab, he told this proverb to explain his subjects, and it just perfectly captures that old world. It was pragmatic, it was hierarchical, and everyone was deeply aware of their place in the social pecking order. Power wasn't about rallying a religious group. It was about knowing your rank and knowing your limits. So, what shattered this world? The first major catalyst was the arrival of a brand new kind of visitor from Europe. During the 19th century, a flood of travelers, missionaries, and diplomats showed up, and they brought with them a completely different way of seeing the entire region. The book calls this a gentle crusade, and that name is perfect. It wasn't a military invasion with swords and muskets. It was a cultural one, fought with pens, books, and maps. These Europeans saw themselves as being on a historic mission to save a biblical land from what they viewed as Islamic decay. And, this is the key part, they interpreted everything, the people, the history, the politics, through the lens of religion. And you can almost see this happening in stages. First, they wrote about the Druzes and Moronites as if they were these distinct, ancient tribes that never changed. They, compare the Druze to Scottish Highlanders, creating this romantic but totally fabricated tribal identity. In doing so, they completely ignored centuries of shared culture and the complex social hierarchy that actually existed. And finally, they imposed their own story onto the region, a grand, timeless battle between a progressive Christianity and a despotic Islam.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea in travel books. No. Missionaries were right there, on the ground, actively building this new reality. They set up schools, like the famous Jesuit seminary in Gizir, with the explicit goal of regenerating the local Christians. They were teaching a new generation to see themselves not as subjects in the Ottoman domain of obedience, but as part of a global, European-led Christian world, fundamentally separate from their Muslim and Druze neighbors.
But it wasn't just European ideas that were reshaping how people saw themselves. The political ground itself was shifting violently under their feet, partly thanks to the Ottoman Empire's own attempts at modernization. I mean, just look at how quickly this all happens. The Egyptian invasion in the 1830s completely shatters the old ruling system. Then the Ottoman Empire's own reforms, the Tanzimat, introduced brand new ideas about being a subject of the empire, allowing people, for the first time, to make political claims based on their religious identity. This leads directly to the first attempt to partition the mountain along religious lines in 1842, which basically sets the stage for the all-out war of 1860. And this is why all that violence that plagued the mountain was not some ancient blood feud finally boiling over. It was a thoroughly modern conflict. For the very first time, local elites started using this new language of sect, writing petitions to European consuls and framing their power grabs in terms of representing the Maronite nation or the Druze nation. And in 1842, this brand new sectarian identity became official policy. Pushed by European powers, the Ottomans very reluctantly agreed to partition Mount Lebanon into a Druze sector and a Christian sector. The Ottoman foreign minister himself warned this was a recipe for disaster because he knew the populations were completely mixed together, but the Europeans just dismissed centuries of coexistence as a mere inconvenience. They literally drew a sectarian line on a map. So, after taking that whole myth apart, what's the big takeaway? Why is understanding this piece of history so incredibly important? The conclusion really is inescapable. The sectarian identity that ripped Mount Lebanon apart wasn't some natural, ancient force that was simply unleashed by modernity. It was constructed. It was actively produced by a specific set of historical forces in a very specific period of time. And you can really break down its production into three key ingredients. First, you have European knowledge, the travelers and missionaries who invented the idea of separate warring tribes. Second, Ottoman politics, the reforms that created a new political system where religious identity suddenly mattered. And third, the local elites, who quickly learned to use this new language to fight for power. And this isn't just a story about 19th century Lebanon, right? It's a profound lesson about the nature of identity itself. It shows us that the communities we belong to, the labels we use for ourselves and others, aren't these timeless truths handed down from the ancient past. They are shaped, molded, and sometimes completely invented by the forces of politics, power, and the stories that we choose to tell. And that leaves us with a critical and maybe uncomfortable question to think about. The story of Mount Lebanon is a powerful reminder that history doesn't just happen to us, it makes us. So which of the identities that feel so natural and so real to us today are, right now, being constructed by the political forces of our own time?